Perfect. Welcome, everybody, to the first of our planned series of events on the impact of AI in light microscopy. Now, there is an absolute ton of information for us to cover in this field. It's very broad right now. So we're going to have a conversation today that focuses on a few discussion goals. So we're going to talk some about how AI is reshaping light microscopy workflows, discuss some scientific, ethical, and operational implications, possibly identify some roles for core facilities and researchers, and encourage some community-driven standards and best practices, which I think we as a community can work on developing together. The reason that we're here today is largely because we can now do things with AI that look like microscopy images. So AI, we often think about our LLMs, right? Our text generating AI tools. But over the past few months and even few weeks, there have been a tremendous amount of developments in the area of image generation. And I often think about image generation as a marketing tool, right? Companies are using it to make commercials, things like that. We see it on social media, but I actually found this on social media. Someone said, hey, wait a second, we can create entirely synthetic microscopy images now that look real to the human eye just using AI. So this is an AI generated image that I found on Blue Sky initially that was generated using this particular prompt. So this prompt is relatively detailed, but it does highlight the fact that it's pretty straightforward for you to put together an image like this using any one of these tools. And you may wonder, okay, do you need a subscription? Are these upper level AI tools that you're using? Well, this was originally made in Gemini Pro, and you can actually see that based on the little logo that's down on the bottom right. Now, in the first image that I showed you, I actually covered that and cropped it to show you how easy it is to fake that and remove that from the images, right? So if this was presented in a seminar, it'd be very difficult to tell whether or not this was a true image that was actually taken on a microscope. This is the same image essentially generated with ChatGPT, the free version. You don't even have to log in. I simply dumped that prompt in there yesterday, and this is the image that you get back as a result. If you carefully evaluate this, there are some red flags that would point to it not being of biological origin, but on first glance and for the untrained eye, these are very convincing images. This is what happens if you ask it to make a colorblind friendly version, for example. You can also do this with Western blots. So this is another type, right, of imaging data that all of a sudden it's become very easy for us to generate. So this is the prompt that was used. Again, this initial image came off of a Blue Sky, but I was able to do the same thing. Again, base level ChatGPT using the same prompt. The upper left is an image of what happened when I just put that prompt in. The bottom right is an image of what happened when I said, please make it more realistic looking. So today, with that context, we're going to have a conversation. This is going to be a relatively informal discussion, but I have invited a couple people specifically to participate because their backgrounds are particularly pertinent for this conversation. So Doug is here with us. Doug is a training and education working group member who is an expert in image ethics and has a long history of having worked through the transition from film to digital. And now as we're moving from digital to kind of AI influence on our microscopy, he has some really good perspectives for us. And then Bill is also joining us from UMass Chan Medical School. So Bill and I work together on some of the IT committees and the AI advisory committees here at UMass Chan in Worcester. And he's going to be able to provide us some perspective from the upper administration standpoint and from the IT side about some of these problems that we're facing here currently in the light microscopy field and how they impact science as a whole. So these are our main discussion topics for today. I have a number of sub-questions under these topics, but I don't want to put those up on the screen and just dominate the screen with static slides. So what I'm going to do here is stop sharing these slides and instead jump to sharing our Padlet. So Dina has put a link to the Padlet in the chat. And for those of you who have used Padlet before, this is an interactive board that allows everyone to comment. So I'm going to share it here, but you can also directly access it at the link that's being shared, and you should be able to make comments. Let us know in the Zoom chat if you're having trouble with accessibility. And I would encourage everybody to scroll through. You can see there's a lot on here. This is essentially broken down by those conversation topics that were listed on the last slide that I showed. But I'm anticipating that we'll jump around a good bit. So don't hesitate to answer questions, put up thoughts about questions that are on here under different topics. We'll get to as much as we can today. And then I do anticipate that this will be an ongoing conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn to this first topic of scientific integrity and trustworthiness. And I think we can, kind of grab bag, take a stab at any of these questions, but maybe we'd start with how do we ensure AI generated or enhanced images remain scientifically trustworthy? Doug and Bill, do either of you have a thought? Want to kick us off with that?
Um,
Not to put you both on the spot
yeah,
already.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's a big thing to wrap your head around too.
Right.
Do you have, if you have something, Bill, I'll follow up behind you.
Okay, my perspective on this, and Christine and I have chatted a little bit about this, is that, there needs to be some way of kind of creating ways to have roles and responsibilities where there is kind of an independent entity that can validate the images so that you can go back to some sort of validated image at some point and have a person who's almost like a trusted repository person who would kind of keep these images and be able to say, yes, there's some way that we can trace this back to something that we have been able to document is actually a valid image. And so we can talk a little bit more about the details of that. But I think without that, you're going to be awash in this kind of sea of, well, what is it? And where is it? And without any sort of foundation for saying we actually can link back to a real image.
We were having a discussion before we came on about the fact that at least at the moment, the proprietary image files that we, bang our heads against the wall again because ND2 doesn't talk to CZI, doesn't talk to LIF, may actually help us in the short run until AI figures out how to write to those obscure formats. Just because then we have that in a sense will be our original data, but how long that will last is a little hard to tell.
Well, the way that AI can code, it's not going to last very long.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think that brings us to an interesting point is that this may actually be a change in the way science is done that reinforces the role and importance of core facilities. Because if you have core facility billing records and access records for image generation, and even better, backups off of your instruments where the data was generated, that in some ways is a validation of your data chain of custody. So I at least would anticipate that it would be more difficult to prove the validity of data that comes off a microscope that doesn't have those sorts of records and structure behind it than something that's in a research core. The flip side of that is, right, we're talking about these proprietary image formats. What about our home-built microscopes, right? What about ones that have, only produce TIFFs because the software has been home coded? That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. Well, and maybe this, at least for the commercial instruments, this is something we may need to press our vendor partners and say, is there a way? Uh, Andy's mentioned in the chat about blockchain. Maybe there is some way we can create that chain of custody so that yes, it's in a proprietary file format, but it's also got some other sort of validation encrypted or otherwise in it that um, again may just buy us time in the long run, but we got to do something.
For sure. For sure. Caroline in the chat too is mentioning watermarks, right? Or some sort of digital fingerprint. Um, I know my team has tossed around the idea that the manufacturer should actually be providing that as part of a service, right? And so you could see it as something that's tied into your service contract. Not that all of us would love that, but that there's some sort of data verification protocol that the manufacturers provide potentially. But again, that leaves us with the open question about home built scopes and what we do there. And I don't have answers there.
And I think watermarks can be hacked as well. And so I'm thinking about the question, the suggestion just came out about hashes, and I think that's kind of starting in the right direction. Where if you can validate off a microscope an image and create a hash of that image, then you really do have something that I think probably realistically can represent. That kind of chain of custody back to an authoritatively captured image. So I think that's a potential way to start. But then there's like, okay, do we have a repository of those? Are those linked? Who manages those? To Christina's point about you need chain of custody, you need kind of a trusted repository manager. I think there's like Christine was saying, it's going to change the way you do things, but establishing a foundation of trust that you can demonstrate an authoritative image, I think is kind of an interesting approach.
Bill, one
Bill,
of
the
the people
question
in
came
the
up about
okay.
what is a hash?
Yeah, so a hash is an algorithm you run across any kind of file. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be an image, and what it does is it creates a short numerical representation of that file that is unique to that file. And I know that there's a couple, like there's MD5 hashes, and there's some 256-bit hashes as well. And the more complex, the more secure they are, the more likely that it's unique. But it's just that you can think about it as a code that represents the uniqueness of a particular file that you can use to represent that file. And you would store that away, the file you would continue to share and work with, but that code, that hash would be stored away, kind of kept secret. And then when people are like, how do you know it's really that image? And then they could run the same algorithm across it. And if the hashes match, it's the same image. If the hashes don't match, then something has been altered in that image.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Doug, I know I talked over you there.
Well, I was just going to say the same thing that you brought up.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So as we talk about, image acquisition and ensuring the fidelity of image acquisition, we all know as microscopists and imagers and data generators that the actual acquisition of the data at the microscope is only the first part of what we do with the data. And so I think, we can start to talk a little bit here about the impact of AI on data processing, right? And the next question that we had listed up here is what is the line between restoration, reconstruction, and fabrication? And this could probably be an hour-long conversation as well, and vary somewhat depending on the type of microscopy that you're doing. But Doug, based on your perspective, do you have thoughts on this in terms of how it's been handled historically, or what we should think about applying now that we can do so many things with AI?
Well, when we first started doing deconvolution, there was a lot of skepticism. It's like, how do you take these out of focus images and somehow make in focus images? It's clear, magic. And vendors that didn't do deconvolution cast aspersion on people who did. But yet it's become accepted partly because we can see all the math. And people have worked out a couple of different approaches to it. They know how that works. So that's fine. And I saw a recent paper was this microtubule does not exist, super resolution microscopy image generation using a diffusion model. So somebody was trying to, in a sense, create enough similar data from a small subset to be able to properly train their large language model, I think it was. Um, you know, that stuff makes me a little nervous, but at least they're being really upfront with how they got there. I think that this is the biggest problem is, you have people who really understand how AI works, doing stuff and going, look, this is amazing. And then we have the people who sit at our microscopes that, drive the lens into the slide and, all the the dumb things that we've seen as we run our core facilities. They want to use AI too, but they don't want to apply anywhere near the amount of rigor and replicates and hopefully some wisdom. They just want the answer. I mean, they're the same people. It's like, oh, I just saw this image analysis protocol. I have no idea what it does, but I'm just going to run it just like they said in the paper. They make me nervous.
Understandably so. Understandably so. And I think this ties in a little bit too with the question of explicit disclosure of AI use in image processing and in image capture, right? And so I think the easy answer to that question is it should always be disclosed, right? We should disclose everything. I think the challenging part comes in when the users may not even know they're using it. And when it's integrated into, again, image acquisition, some sort of, again, smart touch, like I'm automatically going to determine your exposure settings type image capture, that becomes more challenging to report in your methods. So it becomes a question too, it kind of tails into what are our responsibilities as, core leaders and imaging professionals in terms of education about these tools? How does this change what we need to teach, both when we're sitting next to somebody at the microscope, but also when it comes to data and data handling?
Oh gosh. I mean, you can lead a horse to water. And there are some, we do a workshop here. We've done it for a number of years. We're talking about digital images and ethics and all those things. And I get questions, and it's wonderful when people ask questions, even if they don't remember this stuff, at least they're asking. But there are also folks that, that don't go to the workshops, that just do stuff and wonder why it blows up. You're looking at that second question about restoration, reconstruction, and fabrication. Sometimes people are creating stuff and they're not necessarily intending to deceive. They just don't know how they got there.
Right.
And, that's not good science, but it's unfortunately the reality that we sometimes see.
Yeah.
I think it might also be interesting to take a look at kind of the other end of the process where you have a researcher who will at some point want to be able to show the math of their science and say, I can trace my scientific conclusions back to these original documents that were generated as part of my research, i.e. images from a microscope in this case. And so if they can't create that, dotted line back in some sort of logical fashion, what are the algorithms that were used to modify this image? How can I at least make that explicit? And I think it's going to be difficult for them potentially to defend their science. And I think that's kind of that I think is ultimately where the rubber might meet the road also.
No, I think that's a really good point, Bill, because it's something that I think about a lot in terms of the different impacts of this environment in which we're finding ourselves doing science based on where you are in your career. So as a graduate student, as a postdoc, as an independent scientist, as a core facility user, the questions and challenges that you may face regarding the use of AI in your work are different, right? So you have, as a graduate student, you may face the situation, not only do I use AI, but how do I prove to my PI that I did not? How do I prove to someone who questions my data that my data are real? And that's where having those records and having that complete traceability, I think, is going to be so important from that reference point. And I'm hoping that's something that I at least can communicate to my users is, you do need your data to be auditable, particularly now. And that's one of the reasons we all, every day, I think I do this every day, discourage people from exporting as a TIFF file, right? Like, let's just not, because you immediately break that traceability chain. So I think a good question came up in the chat about data safety. And I know this is one that Bill's thought a lot about and has some perspective on from UMass in particular, right? So is our data safe with AI? How do we make sure that our data is safe? And how do we ensure that the microscopes aren't just sharing our data with the vendors to train their models?
Yeah, Eduardo, that was a great question. The answer is no, you can't. A lot of we've just gone through a process of creating safe havens for working with chat tool LLMs like ChatGPT and stuff like that. And the answer is right now, if you just go out to ChatGPT, it will capture your data and it will reuse your data and it will train on your data. So your data are not safe if you just go out to these public sites. You have to create kind of a private entity. You have to create a private implementation or a private instance of that uses these tools. And there are companies, AWS and Azure do this all the time. But you have to have that. You have to have a contractually. Otherwise, they will train on your data, so your data are not safe. And I think getting messages like that out to folks and letting them know the risks they're taking by using particularly these public tools is a really important first step also.
I was just reading an article yesterday or today about a senior leader at a large company who had to tell their directors, no, you can't take our code and put it in Chat GPT. It's intellectual property, and we have no control over it once it's left, our secure environment. And people looked at this woman as if she had like two heads. They just didn't understand.
Yeah, if you put your pre-disclosure information in ChatGPT, you have disclosed it.
And so I think that answers somewhat Lisa's question in the chat here about what is bad about sharing data with the vendors. And I think on the face of it, unannotated raw data, it's a question of how much that's relevant to IP. But in general, you know, any data disclosure from an IP standpoint, that's now public. We no longer have a claim to that data, a legal claim that we can build invention disclosure or patent application around. So I think that's the main concern from a data integrity and safety standpoint. None of us are handling, well, typically not handling patient data on our microscopes, right? And so that's not the level of concern that's more common, at least in my facility. It's more a question of, what discoveries are we making on the systems that could potentially be disclosed either with or without our knowledge before we're ready to publish them or before we fully capture the potential impact of those data in terms of IP licensing and all of those issues for sure. And I think, we absolutely need to work with the vendors on this. I think the transparency here between what we're doing in our cores and what our concerns are, but also how they can potentially support and make this as transparent as possible is a good thing. I don't think any of the vendors are going to want microscopes to become a thing of the past because everyone's just generating their images using, AI tools, right? Like that's not the goal of anybody here in this room. So it becomes a question of how do we integrate these tools into our science to make it better and not worse? And that I think is something that we're struggling with as a community right now. So hopefully maybe we'll come to some conclusions here as we chat a little bit more. I do think the point that was made in the chat too is that there are absolutely totally valid uses for these tools. And I want to be absolutely clear that these tools definitely have scientific impacts and there are absolutely reasons to use them. It becomes a question of, how we use them in a productive way, I think, to support the work that we're already doing. And so was planning to say something at the top of the hour when we kicked this off about how we're not making a judgment today about good, AI bad, right? We're just kind of talking through what the impacts are going to be and how, as a community, we integrate these tools into our existing research environments. Because I think we're all pretty much in agreement. These tools are here. They're likely here to stay. They're only going to get more complex. And so figuring out some guidelines as a community is potentially a useful way we can spend our time at the moment, I think. So let's see. We've got a question about, is it reasonable or possible to require research to only utilize AI workflows that don't alter pixel data, e.g. non-destructive pipelines, image analysis only workflows, etc.? What do you think, Doug?
Well, for image analysis, some of the segmentation stuff that AI can do that was always difficult in the past is amazing. Um, I have a friend here at the university who's constantly harping on the fact that there needs to be a human in the loop. And you know, any there are some things that AI can do that humans can't really wrap their heads around very well. But some of these things, um, you know, if you're using data that wasn't the same as what trained the AI model, things like that, you start running into potential errors. So when I told the university a couple of years ago, I said, we needed to have an image analysis core, but we need someone who's got 1 foot in biology and 1 foot in the computing world, so that because I would read these AI papers and they would say, we did this, and the first time through we went, oh shoot, that's not right. And they could tell there was something wrong with it. And then they tweak stuff, and then the next time it worked. And so that iterative process of a human looking at it and going, that's not right, um, I think is still going to be critical going forward. Um, I don't know if I really answered the question, but yeah, I'm a little concerned about altering the pixels. We do that with other software, but at least it's got a known mathematical algorithm, at least most of them do. Um, Whereas with AI, this is one of the problems with certain types of filters on digital images is, are they doing a global transformation of the image where everything is changed in some semi-uniform fashion, or are they changing in, like a sharpening filter? The pixels on one side of something are changed differently than the pixels on another side, so that you end up, and so those kind of things you want to, I, all I can do is hold up a caution flag and go, beware.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of takes us to our next topic area about ground truth and biological accuracy too. So, I think for me at least, there's a very black and white, obviously generating data completely out of essentially thin air using one of these tools is fraud, in terms of a synthetic microscopy image. But what about an image that's generated using a trained model, right? So people are doing this now where they've fed models a whole bunch of IF data, so stained tissue sections, and then they, feed it an unstained slide and say, tell me where the staining is going to be. And at least the papers make that look relatively accurate. So the question there becomes, how do we compare that to data generated off samples that have physically been stained in the lab?
Oh gosh, I saw this demonstrated. I went to a small meeting in, I think it was 2017, and my hand went up at the end, and I said, so I don't know entirely how you got there. The pictures are amazing. I'm very much impressed. What happens when the biology bites you in the butt? Because sometimes the answer that we get from a sample, could be artifacts and other things, just doesn't look like what we expected. And if the training set is training things such that, stuff's going to be consistent, and we all know that consistency is hard to achieve, um, how do we check that? I don't know the answer to that. And I recently was talking with someone about their samples and different ways of doing sample prep. I started out as an electron microscope guy, so fixation is always in the back of my mind. Um, and if somebody's doing things on, like some of the research is doing artificial H&Es on a transmitted light section. What happens if a different histotech cuts the sections? if the knife, the knife's old and it's chattery, there's just a lot of things, variables that I'm not sure yet can be compensated for or even thought about because users don't consider all those variables, and one of my biggest concerns is someone's going to ask ChatGPT for a fixation protocol and they don't know the difference between a fixation protocol for plants, for C. elegans, for mammalian cells, all that. They just get an answer and it's a good answer but in the wrong situation. So that's why they talk to us.
I think there's also kind of a very basic difference, essential difference between AI and what would be an algorithm. So, for example, when you run an image through an algorithm and you do it a second time, you would expect the same result. So, but that does not happen with large language models because there's so many layers in the neural network and there's so many parameters, and the parameters are shifting and changing that you're going to get a different answer every time you run it through the large language model. So, what does that mean in terms of reproducibility? And the answer is it's a very different beast. And people have been talking about, yes, you need training sets. You need to be able to, it's really a matter of like statistical estimation of what I believe the truth might be running it through a large language model rather than I ran it through this algorithm and I'm going to get the same answer every time. And I think there's just a really essential qualitative difference between how they work versus how we've expect computer things we run through computers to work in the past.
That is a great point, Bill. And I don't think I've thought about that one enough. Doug, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Well, I was just going to say, when we're doing image analysis, at least classically in the past, the assumption was is there's probably at least a 5% or 10% amount of error built into, because a human did the selection, um, or interoperator error and things like that. So people would tell me, yeah, we had this really small difference. It's like, that's probably noise. Um, but yeah, I agree with Bill. We if if we can't necessarily know exactly what we're going to get out every single time, we're in trouble.
And they've dealt with this in the medical world for a long time for things like trying to identify breast cancers and images and stuff like that. And it's really a matter of you have to create your own custom LLM with your own custom training data, and um, you have to train that large language model to provide accurate results, and then you have to be able to demonstrate that by having it correctly answer the training data. And that builds your trust that the LLM is actually delivering the types of results, the predictive modeling or whatever you're looking for. And that's just a very, very different approach than I think what we've asked computers to do in the past.
Well, things like what you're talking about, and also like the H&Es and the other special stains being done on transmitted light images, those things will eventually, to be approved for use in medical practice, have to go through rigorous testing with the FDA. Uh, we're not going to probably see that kind of rigorous testing in various labs.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that one of my major concerns at this point is if we do end up with a tremendous amount of AI generated data in the scientific literature, that immediately results in a fair amount of financial waste, right? When people are trying to replicate experiments that were not actually done, or there was only synthetic data generated and the results are going to be different. So we are, I feel like, at a certain point at this precipice where we have, our scientific literature is not perfect, right? Retraction Walk teaches us that on a daily basis. But from an image manipulation standpoint, there have been sort of a canonical series of steps that people can watch for when it comes to image manipulation. Now it's an entirely new kind of bag of tricks when it comes to data generation. And the question becomes, what safeguards do we put into place to catch these situations when they happen? And I think we all recognize the fact that morally, ethically, data generation is not something that's going to ever be approved of, but it is something that is going to happen. And it becomes a question of, how do we catch that before it becomes a major issue in the body of literature that we all rely on to build our own research programs off of. So with that, I was going to pivot to this other question about should synthetic images ever be used for hypothesis generation, which I think is interesting in this, pseudo H&E, pseudo IF staining idea, right? So if you trained your image generation model on a defined data set and then ran some other samples through it and saw something interesting, you have a hypothesis generation now. Is that something that you should then apply for a grant to investigate? Is that valid? Maybe. I don't know. But that was kind of the framing for that question there, right? It's less I told ChatGPT what I wanted my image to look like and generated it, and now I have a thought about it. And was more if we're using models to generate synthetic images based off a trained model, are those defining areas of research that are worthy of, scientific effort and dollars when it comes to experimentation? I don't know. I don't know. But we can move on to thinking about what our core responsibilities and governance topics might be here too, in terms of vetting AI tools, right? So, Bill, you touched on this a little bit in terms of the AI tool set that UMass has put together for internal use. Based on your experience, what's your perspective on vetting AI tools for users and or making recommendations for or against the use of them?
Wow.
It's a big question, I know, sorry.
That's a tough one because what we're finding is that they produce absolutely, particularly large language models, absolutely spectacular results, and their ability to synthesize vast amounts of information is absolutely incredible. However, I'm not sure that the trust follows at the same level as the impressive performance.
Mm.
And so what we're seeing is that and there was a comment earlier about the human in the loop, right? I think that's just so important that there has to be someone who says, I have the ability to validate this and be accountable for that. One of the things that we really stress is that you are accountable for everything that you ask an LLM to generate because you are going to be putting it out under your name. You can't just blame AI for any mistakes or, like fake references or anything else that's generated. So I think the accountability, understanding the accountability pieces like it is really important. And I think as we start to get to like, how can I trust this image is real? There has to be sort of, and you talked about this right at the beginning, Christina, what is the chain of custody? What is the chain of accountability? How can I trust this? Or how can I put my name behind something that I have generated, some sort of result that I have generated through the use of these tools? Sorry, that's kind of a non-answer, but it's
No, I like it. And I think that's definitely an area that is super important for us to emphasize for our users, right? And I know that I have a lot of users that are microscopy novices, perhaps, and come in and really want us to set the setting of the microscope for them. And then we may find out 3 years later they've never changed the settings because they just, assume that they're right because we helped them with that, right? And that becomes a user education issue. And there's a certain amount of accountability for your own science that is, I think, both a challenge, but also at the same time, very essential for us to teach for all of our users and people that we're trying to do science with. So given that, Doug, do you have any perspective on that based on your years of experience?
Well, again, we can try and teach the users, but whether sometimes it just doesn't want to stick. Um, one of the things that I thought about, and this is getting a little off topic, is we could use some help from the vendors to dial down the sales pitches.
Mm.
Um, those of us that have been in the business long enough have possibly bought an instrument that was like oversold as to what it could actually do. Not to mention company names, but our first multiphoton did not perform anywhere near like we were told it could. Um, so I think we need to have some honest discussions about AI. Some of the stuff like the Nikon stuff where they can help the user get their settings and things like that. Great for introducing people how to use the microscope. I think it's a terrific application. But we've had discussions, I think it was more in ABRF, where we were talking about some of the denoising algorithms, where it is changing things on an individual pixel basis. That's worrisome. And uh, it's hard enough for us to keep up with it so that we can then turn around and, because it's changing, it's like riding a bicycle downhill and your brakes only can do so much. We're on this ride, but we're trying to keep up with what's going on. Um, but yeah, it would be really helpful if the vendors would dial back some of the sales stuff to being more realistic about, yes, it can, there's, yes, it can do this and it's amazing and it's wonderful, but be aware that this is also the caveat or the danger.
Yes. Absolutely. Well, I think this ties into both user training, but also core facility personnel training when it comes to the application of these various tools. And all of us who run research cores know that we wear a million different hats during the day, from IT professional to, optics engineer to data acquisition specialist. So I think the question becomes too, how do we train ourselves and our staff? How do we learn what we need to know given this current reality? And Bill's team has been working hard on some trainings at UMass, both about AI tools and about AlphaFold and the uses of AlphaFold in particular. Bill, do you have any insights from what your team has done in terms of what's been useful for knowledge uptake about these areas?
Um, just a little bit. I would say that we found that we just really need to start at ground zero in terms of there's just so much just lack of understanding about Gen AI in general and what these tools do and how they work and what you can use them for. And so our training has been so foundational. It's really been like, what is it? How does it work? So I think that for us, we're finding ourselves at the bottom of a pretty steep hill we need to climb up just in terms of, getting people to a place where they can feel they have a certain amount of trust in their ability to do something with the tool where they have at least some understanding of how it works.
Well, I think this might be an interesting spot too for the BINA Training and Education Working Group to potentially be a little bit active in too, in terms of if we're able to identify particularly useful training modules or other resources that cores could incorporate into their existing, training pipelines. That might be a place that we could provide some support. But if anybody has any suggestions for those sorts of resources or has done that sort of training in their core already, please don't hesitate to put information in the chat or on the Padlet about that. We'd love to hear more about that. I think it also becomes a question of, I know there was a mention of using AI tools to identify AI images in the chat, and about how some of the publishers are doing that now. My understanding is that those are definitely not foolproof at this point, but that they also have the flip side of it is that they can false flag things sometimes that are actually real, which, as long as you've got a data chain of custody, and again, you can provide access to those real images, that may not be a problem, but that's a whole other headache, I think, for researchers to potentially untangle as well. So I think one of the other questions is, and we may want to end here, is about misconceptions about AI. So, what misconceptions about AI, given that we're talking about how we would train and educate users potentially who are accessing these tools and using them for science in ways that they never have before, what would need to be accurately corrected? What would be the messaging points that we would need when talking to our users about these particular tools? Anybody got thoughts?
Well, I think probably the thing that people need to understand is that AI is at this point not actually intelligent. It's predictive, and it can be really good at it, and especially within what it's trained in. One of the reasons that we've seen hallucinations, though, is it gets cocky, um, and in a sense, they're beginning to realize that they need guardrails within the models so that they don't go down those areas where they don't really know what they're doing. Um, but it is so much the wild, wild west right now. Um, you know, the companies that are pushing the big models, the big names, Palantir, Amazon, Google, OpenAI, Grok, all the others, they want you to think that they can do just about anything because it's a business push, it's an advertising thing. Um, but there are no caveats in a lot of that.
I'm going to lean slightly on Bill here for an administration perspective too. So one other thing along that idea of misconceptions about AI is that, we're all here because we're facing this on a daily basis, but for some of us, it's a challenge to interface with both our administration and our IT department and figure out how we better work across those departments to ensure that we're both communicating with our users in ways that reinforce what's required from our IT and information security side, but then also how, the administration is backing up the use of AI tools at our campus. Do you have any thoughts on how we're doing that at UMass Chan that might be useful for everybody? One of the common areas of discussion amongst us core directors is how do we better talk to our administrators and our IT teams to help integrate what our needs with the needs of the institution?
Yeah, that's a pretty expansive topic. I would
Yeah.
say that just starting at the leadership level, the huge concerns that originally came out were things about, loss of intellectual property. You don't know what these like ChatGPT and things like that are going to be doing, the sense of individual accountability, making sure people understand what their responsibilities are and how that responsibility is kind of reflected in the science that they do. And I think that was sort of the generation of a lot of the work that we did initially to set up kind of a private data commons where the data weren't being sucked into ChatGPT or being sucked into Azure or AWS. Um, and uh, um, from there, I think we're kind of evolving into setting up some governance, institutional governance, where we are attempting to kind of understand institutionally what are the big issues? What are the things? What are the reasonable expectations that we can have for these tools? What are the guardrails we need to put in place? What are the things we need to be concerned about? And then what are kind of the application areas where we as an institution, and this is kind of still way down the road for us, want to make those investments. And part of it is going to be having that kind of feedback loop from users, core people who run cores, scientists, people who are working with the data, people who are trying to come up with the safety guardrails, people who are also attempting to help us um, respond to the ever-changing regulatory frameworks that are coming to us from the government and from our sponsors. And so we're just trying to create a virtuous cycle of understanding, implementation, improvement, evaluation, prioritization across the institution. And this is everything from, I want a tool for my microscope core to I want something that I can use to, process my financial data for my financial outcomes or the financial projections for my institution. So it's kind of a big answer, but we all find ourselves in the same process of trying to understand, trying to assess, trying to recommend, trying to learn from our recommendations, and then trying to also come up with what are the priorities that are important for our institution, and how do we want to work through those priorities. So, sorry, it's kind of a big answer. I hope that's what you were looking for.
No, that was fantastic. I think this is an area where everything is so nebulous right now, including even our definitions of what is AI, right? That we're all kind of scrambling to keep up with both the advances that are being made, but then also figure out from the both regulatory side and the education side what we all need to do as professionals to help integrate these tools into science in a way that's robust and encourages data fidelity. There is a comment in the chat here too, which we can certainly end on about clarifying what we're describing as AI in imaging, right? Algorithms versus LLMs versus neural nets. I actually had a slide that I decided not to show, but that had a bunch of definitions of those different terms because I feel like everybody approaches these topics from a different perspective and a different educational background. So, Bill, just in our last few minutes, when you've been doing your AI education here at UMass Chan for the researchers, are you starting from that kind of foundational level to make sure that everybody's framework is the same, or how do you approach that information?
Yeah, this is super important. A lot of the stuff we've been focusing on have been generative AI, large language models. So we really try to be careful up front to let them know the entire expanse of AI, which dates back to the 30s and has lots of things like machine learning and predictive modeling that go back. And to Christian's comment, everybody calls everything AI now, and some of it's just like, hey, I wrote an algorithm, but I'm going to call it AI. So there's a lot of that going on, but what we've really been focusing on right now is like, what are large language models? What is generative AI? And trying to just pull that out and focus on that for right now, because that seems to be the area where we need the most education, the most understanding, and the most just kind of wrapping our arms around what is the nature of this technology.
Thank you. That's perfect. I think that leaves us with a nice framework potentially for some future discussions that might be a little bit more focused on specific different topics. So in the last 2 minutes here, while we're still discussing and wrapping up, if you would like one of these conversations focused specifically on LLMs, focused on DNNs, focused on analysis tools, let us know in the chat or on the Padlet because we're trying to make sure that we're responding to the community needs when we talk about these different topics. Doug, if I can just turn back to you for our last few comments, how are you seeing this sorts of education done at your institution? Has anybody tackled this yet there?
We just hired someone to be sort of, for lack of a better name, the AI czar. And they are still in the formative process, but one of the things that I'm taking away from this personally is I need to get I need to put my quarter on the machine and try and get a piece of his time to say, hey, we need to start thinking about this. Talk to my colleagues in like the medical imaging field, another place where pixels are important, and try and make sure that this particular niche of pixel-based data um, is something that not only we have the tools to do what might be interesting going forward, but also we're protecting it so that it isn't manipulated in the wrong way.
Absolutely. I think that's been one of the challenges for us here at the scope, which has been again real helpful to have Bill on board, is knowing where those pockets of expertise are and who to specifically talk to, because a lot of the issues surrounding AI are so vastly different than what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is much more of which microscope should I use or how should I prep my sample. Though I did love the mention on the Padlet of people doing vibe preps using protocols that they've just found by asking ChatGPT ChatGPT, and I've definitely seen my share of that. I've also seen my share of, well, ChatGPT told me to use this microscope in your course, so that's the one that I'm going to use. And I think keeping that human in the loop is definitely super important for all of us. So with that, we're at the hour. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And we're going to leave the Padlet open for a bit. So feel free to, if you have more thoughts, drop them there. And also get in touch with us if you have topics you'd like us to cover in future sessions. So thank you again, everyone. And a big thank you to Doug and Bill for taking the time to be with us today.